weekend that they realized that she was gone. The FBI should have immediately jumped in and taken over?
I think once this moved from a search posture to a possible kidnapping, the FBI, they're the premier agency in the world to deal with kidnappings, and that's something that
The moment investigators realized Nancy Guthrie had truly vanished, many experts believe the situation should have escalated instantly. In cases where a missing person search begins to resemble a potential abduction, the rules change overnight. At that point, specialists say the investigation should shift into the hands of the one agency known worldwide for handling kidnappings with precision, the FBI. Kidnapping investigations are complex, psychological chess matches. They demand experience, strategy, and resources that many local departments simply don't encounter often enough to master. And while the local police department involved in Nancy's case is filled with dedicated officers, even they quietly admit the challenge. With just 96 detectives on the force, every available investigator has been pushed to the limit, working exhausting hours, chasing leads, reviewing footage, interviewing neighbors, and combing through evidence day after day since Nancy disappeared. But now, the story has taken another turn. Tonight, new developments are emerging in the mysterious disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. And before we go any further, make sure you're subscribed, because what investigators are uncovering in this case is raising questions that have haunted analysts since the very first day Nancy vanished. Why Nancy? Why this house? And why this family? For more than a month, the case has been under intense scrutiny from some of the most experienced behavioral profilers in the country. Inside secure offices and quiet briefing rooms, FBI analysts have been dissecting every detail: timelines, witness accounts, digital footprints, and the subtle patterns hidden in the suspect's actions. Every movement, every statement, every inconsistency has been placed under the microscope. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. That fact alone keeps investigators awake at night. But slowly, piece by piece, a disturbing picture may be forming. Because according to sources close to the investigation, analysts now believe they may be getting closer to understanding something critical, something that could explain why Nancy Guthrie became the center of this chilling mystery in the first place.
Are beginning to understand something important about why she may have been.
It's good that you have two agencies working together.
Investigators say the collaboration between two agencies has been critical. When a case grows this complex, it's no longer about one department working alone. It becomes a coordinated effort. The FBI brings an entire arsenal of resources that smaller departments simply don't have immediate access to. Advanced forensic tools, behavioral profiling teams, national databases, and specialized analysts who deal with the most disturbing crimes in the country. Those capabilities can change the entire direction of an investigation. That doesn't mean the local detectives in Pima County lack skill or commitment. Far from it. But there's an undeniable reality in law enforcement. Experience often comes from volume. Communities like Pima County are known for being relatively safe and affluent, which is a blessing for residents, but it also means investigators rarely face the sheer number of violent cases that larger cities handle every year. And in criminal investigations, repetition sharpens instincts. One former detective explained it bluntly. When you're working in a busy investigative unit, you might handle 300, sometimes even 400 cases in a single year. Each one forces you to read people differently, analyze evidence faster, and recognize patterns that others might miss. That constant exposure becomes the training ground. Detectives aren't born with those instincts. They earn them through years of relentless casework. That's exactly why the partnership with the FBI matters. It combines the dedication of local investigators with the experience and national reach of federal specialists. Together, they can pursue leads that neither agency could fully handle alone. But the deeper investigators dig into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the more unsettling the case becomes. Nancy isn't the kind of victim most people imagine when they think of a violent crime. She's 84 years old, a great-grandmother, a woman who moved slowly, relying on medication every single day just to maintain her health. Her heart depends on a pacemaker to keep it beating steadily. Walking even short distances could be difficult for her. In other words, Nancy Guthrie hardly fits the profile of someone who would become the target of a calculated abduction. And yet investigators are increasingly convinced this wasn't random. It wasn't a careless mistake. And it certainly wasn't someone stumbling into the wrong house at the wrong time. Whoever is responsible appears to have known exactly what they were doing. Authorities now believe Nancy Guthrie may have been selected deliberately. Since February 1st, the day she vanished, detectives have been circling one chilling question that refuses to go away. Why would someone deliberately target an 84-year-old woman living alone in a quiet Tucson neighborhood?
but you become a better investigator by the volume of work, right? So when I was a detective in the squad, you're catching like 300, maybe 400 cases a year. That's a lot. And if you're investigating...
Rumors quickly began swirling that the FBI had somehow been kept in the dark during parts of the investigation. Some critics even suggested that evidence was being withheld from federal analysts, an accusation that officials say couldn't be further from reality. When investigators were asked why certain DNA samples weren't immediately shipped to the FBI's forensic labs, the explanation was surprisingly straightforward. During the early stages of the investigation, several pieces of evidence were recovered, including a pair of gloves believed to be connected to the scene. Naturally, the question came up, should the material be sent to the FBI for testing? According to officials involved in the discussions, the answer came down to efficiency, not secrecy. The decision was made to keep the testing within the local lab so that every piece of evidence could be processed in the same system and tracked in one place. Their lab had the capability. The FBI's lab had the capability. Both agencies agreed the local facility could handle it without slowing down the investigation. The sheriff later described the exchange in simple terms. The FBI was consulted, the reasoning was explained, and the response was essentially, that approach makes sense. Keep moving forward. The investigation didn't stall there. It simply moved on to the next urgent lead. Of course, in any operation involving hundreds of investigators, disagreements are inevitable. With nearly 400 officers, analysts, and specialists working pieces of the case, not everyone will see every decision the same way. That's the nature of complex investigations. But officials insist that information, including lab results, has continued to flow between agencies. The collaboration remains active, even when opinions occasionally clash. Still, while those internal debates were happening behind the scenes, another question began capturing the attention of behavioral analysts across the country. What exactly did the offender want? And more importantly, what does the choice of Nancy Guthrie reveal about the mind of the person responsible? According to several experienced FBI profilers, the answers to those questions could dramatically change how the public views this entire case. Because victim selection is rarely random. In many crimes, who the offender chooses can reveal as much as the evidence left behind. One of the first experts to raise this possibility publicly was former FBI agent Jim Fitzgerald. While discussing the investigation during an appearance on Megyn Kelly's program, Fitzgerald pointed to detail investigators considered deeply significant. It wasn't just who was taken, it was when. According to Fitzgerald, the timing of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance may hold one of the most important clues in the entire investigation because it suggests the person behind it may have been watching, waiting, and choosing the exact moment to act.
Before going to New York, and I just want to make sure that the public understands that this is a mom that's missing and is of the utmost importance, which is why many of my colleagues in law enforcement here had some concerns with the way the sheriff was managing this, and especially his communication or very poor communication to the public, making statements that were, well, quite frankly, just awful and incorrect, and taking actions that were incorrect as well. So a number of us decided we needed to say something about it because we did not want it to reflect on our community and the Sheriff's Department, which has been an extraordinary law enforcement agency that I worked with for 3 decades and had a national...
As a reporter here for many years before going to New York, and I just want to make sure that the public understands that this is a mom that's missing and is of the utmost importance, which is why many of my colleagues in law enforcement here had some concerns with the way the sheriff was managing this, and especially his communication or very poor communication to the public, making statements that were, well, quite frankly, just awful, and incorrect, and taking actions that were incorrect as. Well, so a number of us decided we needed to say something about it because we did not want it to reflect on our community and the Sheriff's Department, which has been an extraordinary law enforcement agency that I worked with for 3 decades and had a national reputation. Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home at around 2 o'clock in the morning, not during daylight hours, when people are active outside, not in the early evening, when neighbors are still awake, but in the middle of the night, when the entire neighborhood would have been dark and quiet at 2 in the morning. Most houses are asleep. There are fewer lights, fewer witnesses, and very little movement. In residential streets, Fitzgerald suggested that choosing that moment indicates someone who knew exactly when to approach and understood the environment they were entering. He also highlighted something investigators find unusual about the reward being offered in the case. Authorities and private donors have now put together a reward that exceeds $1 million, yet investigators say that despite the size of that reward, they have not received the type of information that typically emerges in high-profile cases.
Narrowed it down to anything other than we have certain pieces of evidence that we're looking at. Chase leads until you either make it.
Investigators admit the truth is far less dramatic than the rumors circulating online. At this stage, they say the case hasn't narrowed to one clean theory or a single clear suspect. Instead, the investigation is moving the way many complex cases do, slowly, methodically, and lead by lead. Every piece of evidence is examined. Every tip is chased down. Detectives follow each thread until it either leads somewhere meaningful or disappears into a dead end. But while law enforcement continues that careful process, some behavioral experts believe something else about the case is already speaking volumes. The silence. Former FBI profiler Jim Fitzgerald believes the lack of obvious motive could actually be one of the most revealing details in the entire investigation. In his view, the absence of stolen valuables or signs of a burglary suggests something chilling. The offender may not have been interested in money, jewelry, or anything inside the house at all. According to Fitzgerald's analysis, the real target may have been Nancy Guthrie herself. If that theory holds true, the investigation suddenly splits into two very different and equally unsettling directions. That crossroads is something another expert has repeatedly warned investigators about. Mary Ellen O'Toole spent years leading the FBI's elite behavioral analysis unit before moving into academia, where she now teaches forensic science at George Mason University. Drawing from decades of profiling violent offenders, O'Toole believes detectives must carefully consider two completely different possibilities. The first possibility centers on Nancy's family connections. Nancy Guthrie is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, a nationally recognized television journalist. If the crime somehow connects to that relationship, the motive could involve attention, resentment, revenge, or someone seeking to send a message that would ripple far beyond a quiet Tucson neighborhood. But the second possibility paints a much darker, more opportunistic picture. In that scenario, Nancy wasn't chosen because of who her daughter is. She was chosen because of her vulnerability. An 84-year-old woman living alone, limited mobility, a predictable routine, someone who might appear to the wrong person like an easy target. These two theories lead investigators down completely different investigative paths. One points towards someone with a possible personal or symbolic connection to Savannah Guthrie. The other suggests a predator who studies weakness and waits for the right moment to strike. And according to O'Toole, that's exactly why investigators cannot afford to lock onto one theory too quickly. Because the moment you commit to the wrong path too early, the evidence you need most might slip past you unnoticed.
Again, in Tucson, Arizona. Kelly, what more are we learning about that latest news about the DNA found on a glove a couple of miles from Nancy's house?
Well, the snapshot we are getting from investigators is that there's a lot of evidence that they've been dealing with, and a glove and other gloves have been talked about a lot publicly, and they have taken testing of those. They have established DNA profile, and then they've compared it against that database that you referred to, which includes persons all across the country who've been arrested or charged or convicted with a crime. There are differing laws state by state about when someone who's taken into custody must provide their DNA. But it is a vast database, and certainly if there were a criminal history, that would be a good way to identify a potential depositor of that DNA. Then, is it in some way linked to the Guthrie case? That's another big question. So work is being done. There are hundreds of investigators who are on this case working on a stream of different types of approaches. We know, for example, that they have been canvassing gun stores in the area. Why? Because the suspect seen on that doorbell video had a weapon, had a holster that had some interesting identifying markers that authorities are trying to get a better read on. Where was it purchased? What could they learn?
With us once again in Tucson, Arizona, Kelly, what more are we learning about that latest news about the DNA found on a glove a couple miles from NY's house? Well, the snapshot we are getting from investigators is that there's a lot of evidence that they've been dealing with, and a glove and other gloves have been talked about a lot publicly, and they have taken testing of those. They have established DNA profile, and then they've compared against that database that you referred to, which includes persons all across the country who've been arrested or charged or convicted with a crime. There are differing laws state by state about when someone who's taken into custody must provide their DNA, but it is a vast database, and certainly if there were a criminal history, that would be a good way to identify a potential depositor of that DNA. Then is it in some way linked to the Guthrie case? That's another big question. So work is being done. There are hundreds of investigators who are on this case working on a stream of different types of approaches. We know, for example, that they have been canvassing gun stores in the area. Why? Because the suspect seen on that doorbell video had a weapon, had a holster that had some interesting identifying markers that authorities are trying to get a better read on. Where was it purchased? What could? They learn about looking at the first possibility. Former FBI agent and CIA officer Tracy Walder has spoken openly about her view of the case. Walder says she does not believe the available evidence supports the theory that this was a burglary that went wrong. Instead, she points to the level of focus and precision in the suspect's actions. According to Walder, the offender appeared to know exactly when to approach the house and how to carry out the crime without drawing attention. In her analysis, the situation raises the possibility that someone had a grievance involving Savannah Guthrie or had developed an unhealthy fascination with her public profile. If that were the case, targeting Nancy Guthrie could have been seen by the offender as a way to hurt Savannah indirectly. Walder also emphasized something important while discussing this theory. She said she hesitated to speak publicly about it because she does not want Savannah Guthrie to believe she bears any responsibility for what happened. Nevertheless, Walder believes investigators must seriously consider the possibility that the motive may involve Savannah's visibility as a national television figure. Former FBI Special Agent Greg Rogers has also expressed skepticism about the idea that this was a robbery gone wrong. Rogers explained that crimes of opportunity tend to occur quickly and without extensive preparation. What investigators are seeing in this case appears different. Rogers says targeted kidnappings typically involve planning, surveillance, and forethought. They can also involve familiarity with the victim's routine. In other words, the offender may have known details about Nancy Guthrie's daily life that a stranger passing by would not know, that could include her schedule, her health limitations, her reliance on medication, or even the quiet patterns of the neighborhood during the night. Rogers believes those kinds of details suggest someone who had been observing the environment beforehand. Mary Ellen Odell also raised another observation after reviewing the doorbell camera footage recorded the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. According to Odell, one of the first things profilers look for when analyzing footage of a suspect is whether the offender appears as nervous as the situation would normally make someone. In many crimes, suspects display clear signs of anxiety, rushed movements, hesitation, or visible tension. However, what
if the sheriff said it's a mixed sample, if that DNA is mixed with Nancy's DNA, then we know that is the person that took it.
One detail that continues to give investigators cautious optimism is the DNA evidence. According to officials familiar with the case, the sample recovered from the scene appears to be mixed, meaning more than one person's genetic material may be present. And if that mixture includes Nancy's DNA alongside an unknown contributor, it could point directly to the individual who had physical contact with her during the critical moments of the crime. For investigators desperate for a breakthrough, that possibility carries enormous weight. But while forensic teams analyze the lab results, behavioral experts are focusing on something equally revealing: the suspect's demeanor. Former FBI behavioral analyst Mary Ellen O'Toole says the individual seen near the property didn't behave the way most people would in such a high-risk moment. According to her observations, the person's body language appeared surprisingly controlled. His posture remained steady. His movements were deliberate. And perhaps most telling of all, he lingered on the porch longer than someone acting on pure panic typically would. To a trained profiler, that level of calm raises serious questions. O'Toole explains that behavior like this often points in one of two directions. Either the person has committed similar crimes before and knows how to manage the pressure, or the entire act had been rehearsed mentally long before it happened. In other words, the offender may have played the scenario over and over in his mind. Every step imagined, every movement planned. By the time the real moment arrived, it may have felt almost routine. While one branch of the investigation explores Nancy's connection to her high-profile daughter, another path focuses solely on Nancy herself. In that scenario, investigators believe the offender may have selected her because she appeared vulnerable. At 84 years old, Nancy Guthrie lived with limited mobility and significant medical needs. She relied on medication and specialized care just to maintain her daily routine. To the wrong person watching from the outside, that vulnerability might have looked like opportunity. Former FBI profiler Jim Clemente has discussed how someone could have discovered those details about Nancy's situation without ever knowing the family personally. According to Clemente, information like this often surfaces during the most ordinary interactions around a home. Think about the people who regularly pass through residential neighborhoods: repair technicians, electricians, plumbers, landscapers, delivery drivers, or even rideshare drivers dropping someone off nearby. During even a short visit, it's possible to notice who lives in a house, whether they appear to be alone, and how capable they are of protecting themselves. Sometimes it takes only a few minutes to recognize a pattern. An elderly resident answering the door slowly. No other vehicles in the driveway. No visible family members coming or going. To most people, those observations mean nothing. But to a predator quietly studying potential targets, even a brief encounter can reveal everything they need to know.
If the sheriff said it's a mixed sample, if that DNA is mixed with Nancy's DNA, then we know that is.
What gives me hope is the sheriff said it's a mixed sample. If that DNA is mixed with NY's DNA, then we know that is the person that took her. Clementi explained that if someone with harmful intentions recognize that vulnerability, they might view it as an opportunity. There is also a third perspective that blends these two possibilities together. Former FBI profiler Greg McCraw, one of the early architects of modern criminal profiling, suggested that the offender could be someone who had been observing the neighborhood for a period of time and eventually discovered that Nancy Guthrie was connected to a nationally recognized television personality. In that scenario, the suspect may have first noticed Nancy because of her vulnerability, then later realized her connection to Savannah Guthrie and incorporated that discovery into a developing plan. McCraw says investigators often look for behavioral changes after crimes like this. Someone might suddenly alter their daily routine, withdraw from normal activities, or display an unusual level of interest. In the media coverage surrounding the case, Mary Ellen Odell also raised the possibility that the offender may be closely following the media coverage of this investigation. She referenced the Zodiac Killer as an example of a criminal who seemed deeply interested in the publicity surrounding his crimes, and even communicated with the media. In the Nancy Guthrie case, the suspect delivered a ransom note directly to a media outlet, TMZ. That action suggests the offender understood the message would quickly become public. According to Owl, that detail may indicate the individual wanted attention and wanted the world to see the impact of what he had done. Investigators are also examining several physical clues connected to the suspect. One of those clues is the backpack seen in the doorbell footage. Authorities identified it as a 25L Ozark Trail backpack, a product typically sold through Walmart. Initially, investigators hoped this might help identify the buyer. However, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos pointed out that items sold exclusively through Walmart can still end up on secondary markets such as eBay, Facebook Marketplace, or garage sales. That means tracing the purchase history may be more complicated than initially expected. Another potentially significant clue involves forensic evidence. According to Jim Clementi, the suspect covered most of his face, but did not completely conceal his mouth. That detail could have allowed small amounts of biological material, such as saliva or skin cells, to be left behind, even if the DNA recovered does not match anyone currently listed in the CODIS criminal database. Investigators may still have another option. Genetic genealogy allows analysts to compare partial DNA profiles with publicly available genealogy databases and identify distant relatives from their. Investigators can work backward through family trees until they narrow the search to a single individual. This is the same method that ultimately led to the identification of the Golden State Killer decades after his crimes. Investigators are also examining them possibility that a tattoo may be visible in the doorbell camera footage at one point when the suspect's clothing shifts slightly. Profiler Jim Clementi believes a marking on the suspect's skin may appear briefly. Tattoos can provide extremely useful investigative leads because certain designs are associated with specific regions, groups, or even individual tattoo artists. Analysts are reviewing the footage frame by frame to determine whether that marking can be identified and used to narrow the list of potential suspects. After weeks of analysis by experienced investigators and behavioral profilers, one conclusion is becoming increasingly clear. Nancy Guthrie was most likely not chosen randomly. Someone appears to have studied her situation, observed her routine, and recognized her vulnerabilities. That person may have known she lived alone, may have known about her health limitations, and may have chosen the exact moment when the neighborhood would be quietest. Whether the motive involved hostility toward her well-known daughter, predatory calculation, or a combination of factors, investigators believe Nancy Guthrie herself was the intended target. She remains missing tonight, and the reward for information has now reached $1.2 million. Authorities are asking anyone who may have noticed suspicious behavior after February 1st to come forward. That could include someone whose routine changed suddenly, someone who became unusually focused on the case, or someone who seemed to disappear from their normal activities around that time. Anyone with information can contact the FBI at 180 call FBI or reach the Pima County Sheriff's Department directly. Somewhere out there, someone has seen something or knows something.